In a peaceful North Carolina suburb, a respected engineer, a friendly mother, and two young daughters seemed like a picture-perfect family. But behind closed doors, a silent storm was building. When Nancy Cooper vanished, quiet streets turned suspicious, and a single digital clue exposed a truth no one expected. In the quiet, well-planned suburbs of Cary, North Carolina, life moved with a kind of peaceful routine most families hope for. Good schools, friendly neighbors, and wide green spaces made it a place young couples dreamed of when building a future. Among the families who arrived with that same hope were Brad and Nancy Cooper. To the outside world, they appeared confident, accomplished, and settled. Successful professionals raising two daughters in a safe American neighborhood. But behind closed doors, something was quietly breaking. Brad Cooper was born in Canada, a highly intelligent and technically skilled network engineer working for Cisco Systems. People who knew him described him as focused, logical, and reserved. His work required precision, problem-solving, and a calm mind, qualities that shaped his personality both in the office and at home. Nancy, also Canadian, was the opposite in many ways. She was warm, social, and energetic, someone who enjoyed planning community events, spending time with friends, and building a happy environment for her children. Her personality drew people in easily. She was seen as graceful and friendly, a mother who cared deeply for her daughters. Their marriage began with promise, but over the years, tension replaced teamwork. Friends later said their relationship lacked warmth. Arguments started small and grew heavier with time. Some recalled that Brad became rigid and controlling, especially regarding finances and household decisions, while Nancy wanted independence and the freedom to make choices for herself and her children. What began as simple disagreements turned into cold distances and quiet resentment. Nancy tried to maintain peace for the sake of her children, but the emotional disconnect continued to widen. Their neighborhood friends saw signs of discomfort. Nancy sometimes shared small pieces of her struggles, explaining that she felt trapped and unhappy. She had begun imagining a life elsewhere, possibly back in Canada, where her family lived. The idea of separating from Brad grew stronger in her mind. Friends also heard that she was thinking about divorce, a word that carried weight, especially when two children and legal custody were involved. Brad, on the other hand, did not want his daughters taken away. The marriage was hanging by a thread, and both of them knew it. On the surface, the Coopers still moved through the motions of normal life, drop-offs, birthday parties, neighborhood gatherings. People saw a family that looked stable enough, though not particularly affectionate. But behind every polite smile, the strain continued. Those who spent more time with Nancy sensed a woman who was emotionally exhausted and desperate for a lasting solution. The critical weekend in July 2008 started like any other. Nancy spent time preparing for a friend's upcoming event and talked about her growing plans for independence. The topic of divorce returned again and again, and her friends believed she was finally ready to step forward. She was focused, determined, and clear about wanting a happier future for herself and her daughters. Those who spoke to her in those final days later said she sounded hopeful, even relieved, as if she had made a decision that gave her strength. But that hope would not last. On the morning of July 12th, Brad told those around him that Nancy left the house early to go jogging and never returned. It was a simple explanation, one that might have sounded normal in a neighborhood where people exercised outdoors daily. Yet something about it felt strange. Hours passed with no sign of her. Phone calls went unanswered. Nancy's friends, who usually knew her schedule, sensed something was very wrong. She was never the kind of person who disappeared without warning, especially not with two young children at home. Worried neighbors began calling each other, trying to figure out what had happened. Brad told people he was concerned and waiting for news, but several friends noticed that his calmness did not match the seriousness of the situation. He did not show panic or urgency. Instead of searching the neighborhood or calling hospitals, he stayed home. That behavior troubled many people who knew Nancy well. Within hours, suspicion quietly formed. Later that day, her friends contacted the police and filed a missing person report. Officers arrived at the Cooper home, trying to piece together information. Brad repeated the same story. Nancy went jogging and did not come back. He described her route, her clothing, and the time she left. Yet nothing about the story provided real direction. There were no witnesses, no neighbors who saw her leave, no camera footage, and no signs she had packed belongings or reached out to anyone before disappearing. As news spread through Cary, concern turned into shock. The community organized searches, hoping she had collapsed, been injured, or gotten lost. Volunteers walked trails and wooded areas. Drivers looked along roadsides. Police dogs searched restricted zones. But every hour that passed increased the fear that something worse had happened. 2 days later, that fear became reality. Nancy's body was discovered in a deserted, undeveloped area near their subdivision. The open field was quiet and isolated, far from public view. It was a place no jogger would normally visit. Police secured the scene and began collecting evidence. Initial observations suggested that the body had been left there deliberately, not by accident. The investigation quickly shifted from a missing person case to a homicide. News reached the community, and grief spread instantly. Friends who had been hoping for a miracle instead received confirmation of the worst possible outcome. People cried, questioned, and wondered how something like this could happen in such a peaceful neighborhood. A feeling of disbelief filled the town. As detectives gathered information, every detail pointed back to the same house, the Cooper home. Their strained marriage, the arguments, the talk of separation, the sudden disappearance, and Brad's unusual calmness all became part of the investigation. Officers interviewed neighbors, friends, co-workers, and family members. The more they learned about the couple's relationship, the more serious the case became. Investigators began examining Brad's behavior and timeline. They searched his car, his home, and eventually his computer. They looked at phone records, internet activity, and any signs of planning. Each digital footprint mattered. What they found would soon become one of the most important elements of the entire case. Something on Brad's computer offered a clue that no one expected. Something precise, technical, and nearly impossible to ignore. At first, it looked like a normal piece of browsing history. But the moment detectives realized what it showed, everything changed. Without knowing it, Brad had left behind a silent witness inside his computer, a Google Maps search viewed before Nancy disappeared, showing the same location where her body was later found. It was a discovery that would move the investigation into a new phase, one driven by digital evidence, technology, and expert analysis. The quiet suburban tragedy was about to become a groundbreaking case, proving how even the most carefully planned actions could be traced in the modern world. The story of Brad and Nancy Cooper was no longer just about a troubled marriage. It was becoming the story of how digital footprints can speak when people choose silence. The discovery of Nancy's body changed the tone of the investigation instantly. What had started as a missing person case was now a homicide, and detectives began working with sharper focus and deeper scrutiny. They returned to every detail of Brad's account, every timeline he offered, and every piece of digital evidence they could recover. Nothing would be taken at face value anymore. Investigators interviewed Brad again, listening closely to the way he described Nancy's disappearance. He repeated the same explanation, that she went jogging alone early in the morning and never returned. But with her body found in a location inconsistent with his story, police noticed the gaps. If Nancy had gone out for a morning run, how did she end up in an isolated, undeveloped field far off the jogging route she normally used? Why had Brad waited so long to alert authorities? And why did his neighbors seem more distraught than he did? Detectives widened their search inside the Cooper home. They looked for any signs of a struggle, any unusual cleaning, or anything out of place. While they found no dramatic physical evidence, what they did find, or rather, what they didn't, became important. There was no proof that Nancy had dressed for a jog. No running shoes placed near the door. No water bottle missing. No signs of her preparing to leave the house that morning at all. Her personal items were untouched, as if she had never stepped outside. With limited physical evidence, investigators turned to technology. Brad was a professional in the field of networks and computers, an expert in systems and data. That meant his digital devices could hold answers he never intended to share. Police seized computers, hard drives, and routers from the house and handed them to forensic analysts skilled in tracking digital activity. If Brad had planned something, they believed his own profession might betray him. As the digital investigation unfolded, detectives also studied the couple's history. Friends described a marriage filled with tension. They told police that Nancy seemed controlled in her daily life. She had limited access to money, struggled to make independent decisions, and often felt watched. They talked about arguments, emotional distance, and Nancy's growing desire to start over. She felt unsafe and unsupported, especially as she planned for a life beyond the marriage. Those details gave police context, but what they needed was evidence, something factual, not emotional. That evidence came from Brad's computer. The Google Maps search was a turning point. Forensic specialists uncovered detailed internet activity showing that Brad had looked up a satellite view of the exact spot where Nancy's body would later be found. The timestamp placed the search before Nancy disappeared. It wasn't a random click. It wasn't accidental. And most importantly, it was a digital trail that could not be easily erased or explained away. Detectives confronted Brad with the information. He denied wrongdoing and insisted he had nothing to do with Nancy's death. His attorneys later argued that the computer evidence could have been tampered with, but investigators stood by their findings. To them, the map search was more than a coincidence. It was a breadcrumb pointing directly to premeditation. The case became more complex as technology experts were brought in to analyze the computer data. Prosecutors believed the digital trail was the strongest link between Brad and the disposal site. Defense teams claimed it was unreliable. The courtroom battle around this evidence would later become one of the most discussed aspects of the case. While police built their digital timeline, they also pieced together the couple's final days. Investigators learned about an argument the night before Nancy disappeared. Tension had been growing for months, but as the topic of separation became real, the stress inside the home increased. Nancy was preparing to take steps that could affect custody, finances, and Brad's role as a father. For someone already struggling with control, the threat of losing stability may have been impossible to accept. The investigation also highlighted Brad's behavior after Nancy vanished. Neighbors had expected panic, urgent calls, public searches. Instead, Brad stayed mostly at home. He did not gather groups to search. He did not rush to the police station for updates. His emotions appeared muted. While behavior alone is not proof, it gave detectives one more reason to look closely. Meanwhile, Nancy's friends refused to stay silent. They spoke to police daily, shared her messages, emails, and concerns. They knew her routines, her plans, and the emotional weight she carried before her death. Their voices helped investigators understand the full picture of the Cooper household. When the digital evidence became public knowledge, the community reacted with shock. The idea that a computer search could reveal such a hidden detail fascinated and frightened people. It showed how modern technology can become a key witness. The smallest file, the shortest click, the tiniest location pin, all could become evidence in a criminal investigation. As the case moved forward, prosecutors built their argument around three pillars: a broken marriage, a pattern of control, and undeniable digital evidence. They believed that Brad, facing the possibility of losing his family and his sense of authority, made a devastating choice. They argued that the Google Maps search was part of a plan to hide Nancy's body in a location he thought no one would find quickly. Brad's defense fought back. They challenged the credibility of the computer analysis and suggested that the data may have been mishandled. They claimed there was no eyewitness, no direct physical evidence linking Brad to the act. Their strategy relied on creating doubt, just enough to make jurors hesitate. For the people of Cary, the trial became a painful reminder that outward appearances can hide deep unhappiness. A couple who seemed like any other family in the neighborhood had been living in a quiet, private crisis. A mother of two had lost her life. Two little girls were left without their mother, and a father was facing the legal consequences of the investigation around him. As months passed, the courtroom became the center of the story. Digital experts explained how data could be traced. Detectives testified about inconsistencies in Brad's statements. Friends spoke about Nancy's fear and emotional isolation. Each voice added a piece to the puzzle. Still, there was no confession. Brad maintained that he was not responsible. The legal battle that followed was long, complicated, and heavily focused on whether the digital evidence was strong enough to prove guilt. Appeals and challenges continued, stretching the case over years. Just when the process seemed settled, new motions appeared, and arguments restarted. It became a legal marathon, not a sprint. But through every twist, one thing remained clear. The investigation had been built with patience, detail, and modern technology. Even without dramatic physical evidence, the digital world had unlocked a story that might otherwise have remained silent. The fate of Brad Cooper would eventually come down to what happened inside the courtroom, the strength of the evidence, and the decisions made in the final phase of the legal process. The resolution of the case, the confession, conviction, and sentencing would arrive later. For now, the community waited, the legal system pushed forward, and the story continued toward a conclusion no one could ignore. The courtroom battles that followed were unlike anything the quiet community of Cary had ever experienced. What began as neighborhood concern had transformed into a complex legal journey, where every statement and every piece of data was examined under a microscope. Detectives, digital experts, neighbors, and friends all took the stand. But despite the careful presentation of evidence, the case did not reach a fast conclusion. Instead, it stretched across years, marked by arguments, appeals, and challenges from both sides. At the heart of the legal debate was technology. Prosecutors believed the Google Maps search was clear proof of planning. The timing matched the disappearance. The location matched where Nancy's body was found. It was precise, time-stamped, and deeply connected to Brad's professional expertise. In their view, it was a digital fingerprint that could not be erased. But Brad's defense team argued that the evidence was not reliable enough to be trusted without question. They suggested gaps in data handling, weaknesses in the analysis, and possible interference. They said there was no witness who saw what happened inside the Cooper home. They said no one saw Brad transport anything. They reminded the court there was no physical DNA evidence tying him directly to the location. Their strategy was not to build an alternate story, but to create doubt. While lawyers fought in the courtroom, the community struggled emotionally. Nancy had been a friend, a mother, and a neighbor. People wanted closure. Her family in Canada wanted answers. And her two young daughters, now living with relatives, were growing up far from their father, learning about the case in quiet, protective fragments. Every hearing, every new development, felt like reopening a wound for those who loved her. In 2011, after a long trial, a verdict finally came. Brad Cooper was convicted of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the decision was read, and the sentence was clear: life in prison. For many, justice had arrived. But the story was not over. Brad's defense filed appeals, focusing on whether evidence had been handled fairly and whether his legal representation had been adequate. The appeals court later determined that certain technical issues required further review. That ruling meant the conviction was overturned, and the case was reopened for additional legal action. It was a shocking moment, especially for Nancy's family, who believed the case had finally reached its end. The ruling did not erase the evidence, but it meant the process had to continue. Prosecutors prepared for a new trial. Defense lawyers prepared to challenge the digital findings again. The possibility of repeating the entire courtroom battle loomed over everyone involved. Years had already been invested. The emotional weight had only grown heavier. The legal system was preparing to start again. During this time, Brad remained in custody. The reality of a second trial, with the same evidence and the same emotional toll, became unavoidable. Families braced themselves for more testimony, more statements, and more legal arguments. Nothing about the case was moving quickly, and every delay added to the stress carried by those closest to Nancy. Eventually, a different path emerged. In 2014, after years of litigation, Brad and his attorneys entered discussions with prosecutors. A plea agreement was offered. Under the terms, Brad would plead guilty to second-degree murder. In return, he would avoid another lengthy trial and would receive a prison sentence with a defined time frame instead of life, without possibility of release. For prosecutors, the plea avoided more appeals and ensured a permanent conviction. For Brad, it meant a chance at eventual freedom, though many years in the future. Brad accepted the agreement. In court, he stood before the judge and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. It was the first time he publicly accepted responsibility for Nancy's death. There were no complicated speeches, no dramatic statements. Just a brief acknowledgement of guilt. The moment was quiet, but meaningful. After years of silence, legal battles, and claims of innocence, the case reached a final turning point. The judge sentenced Brad to a prison term generally falling between 12 and 17 years. The exact duration would depend on behavioral and legal factors inside the correctional system. The outcome meant he would spend a large portion of his life in custody, but the sentence was less severe than life in prison. His daughters would grow up without their mother and without their father beside them, but the legal chapter of the case had finally closed. For Nancy's family, the confession mattered. It was not the ending they wished for, but it was a formal acknowledgement of what happened. Her parents and siblings could finally grieve without the uncertainty of another trial. They took custody of her daughters and raised them in Canada, giving them a stable childhood far from the courtroom battles that had defined the previous years. The case left a strong impression on law enforcement and legal professionals across the country. It showed how modern investigations were changing. In older cases, physical evidence was the center of every trial. But the Cooper case demonstrated that digital footprints could be just as powerful. A single online search, a timestamp, a computer log, small details stored inside a machine could reveal actions that no one witnessed in person. Courts and investigators began increasing training in digital forensics. Officers learned how to recover browsing history, analyze device data, and understand how technology records movement. Experts in computer science took roles alongside detectives and officers. The Cooper case became an example of how modern tools can uncover truth even when physical evidence is limited. In Cary, neighbors eventually moved on, but the memory of the case remained. People remembered a family that once seemed ordinary, a husband with a respected career, a mother full of warmth, and 2 children learning to ride bikes on quiet streets. It showed that even peaceful communities can hide quiet struggles inside familiar walls. For those who knew Nancy, she was not defined by the court case. Friends remembered her smile, her generosity, her love for her daughters. They held onto the image of a mother who tried to create happiness, even in difficult circumstances. The tragedy of her loss became a reminder of the importance of support and understanding in relationships, and of speaking up when something feels wrong. Brad served his sentence in state custody. With time, the courtroom debates faded from public conversation, but the case remained part of true crime history. Students in law, criminology, and forensic technology studied it to understand how digital information could change the direction of an investigation. For many, it became a lesson in how truth can be hidden temporarily, but rarely erased. When the story is told today, it is remembered calmly and respectfully. It is a real event with real people, not a mystery, not a thriller. It is a reminder that harm can grow silently inside a home, unnoticed by neighbors and unseen by friends. It also reminds us that modern evidence does not always come from eyewitnesses or dramatic discoveries. Sometimes it exists quietly inside a computer file, waiting to be found. The case of Brad and Nancy Cooper began in a peaceful neighborhood and ended in a courtroom, shaped by emotional testimonies and digital proof. A family that once seemed complete was left divided forever. The daughters who lost both parents now live with the memory of what happened, protected from the details, but forever changed by them. And the community that once believed such tragedies only happened far away learned that even the calmest streets can hold painful stories. With the confession given, the conviction settled, and the sentence in place, the legal chapter of the Cooper case closed. But the lessons it offered, in relationships, investigations, and technology, continued to be remembered long after the courtroom doors shut and the headlines disappeared. In a quiet Massachusetts town, a young mother and her infant daughter were found murdered in their own bed. The husband vanished overseas, leaving behind chilling questions. Was he a grieving survivor, or a cold-blooded killer hiding in plain sight? This is the story that stunned two nations. In the winter of 2006, the quiet town of Hopkinton, Massachusetts, became the backdrop of a crime so disturbing that it would reverberate across two continents. Hopkinton was known more for its New England charm than for violence, a place where families felt safe and neighbors trusted one another. That sense of security shattered on January 20th, when police were called to the home of a young family and discovered a scene that no one in the community could ever forget. Inside a modest bedroom lay the lifeless bodies of 27-year-old Rachel Entwistle and her 9-month-old daughter, Lillian. Rachel had been shot directly between the eyes, execution style. Beside her, baby Lillian had been killed with a close-range shot to the chest. The house was undisturbed, the doors intact, and there was no sign of forced entry. It was the kind of crime that suggested not a stranger, but someone intimately connected to the family. Rachel and her husband Neil had moved to Massachusetts only a few months earlier, hoping to start a new chapter of their lives. From the outside, they looked like an ordinary couple taking the next steps into adulthood. Rachel, American-born, was described by friends and family as warm, nurturing, and enthusiastic about motherhood. She loved being with her infant daughter and found joy in the small things. Feeding, dressing, and caring for Lillian gave her a sense of purpose. Neil, a British-born computer programmer, seemed quieter and more reserved. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and carried himself with an air of ambition. To those who knew them casually, they appeared to be building a happy life together. But appearances, as it would soon be revealed, were deceptive. The first signs that something was amiss came not with the discovery of the bodies, but with Neil's absence. In the days immediately following the murders, Neil had seemingly vanished. He did not remain in Massachusetts to answer questions, mourn with family, or even to arrange funerals. Instead, he boarded a flight back to his parents' home in Worksop, England. To investigators, this behavior was suspicious from the start. A grieving husband and father might be expected to cling to family, to seek answers, or to cooperate with police. Neil's sudden departure across the Atlantic suggested something else entirely: avoidance and perhaps guilt. Investigators wasted little time piecing together the puzzle of what had happened inside the Entwistle home. The weapon used in the killings was quickly traced. It belonged to Rachel's father, who had kept it securely in the house. Police determined that Neil had taken the gun, used it to shoot both his wife and child, and then calmly returned it to its case before leaving the scene. The deliberate nature of this act suggested premeditation, not a crime of passion. It also pointed squarely at Neil as the only person with both opportunity and access. As the case unfolded, the question of motive loomed large. Why would a young man, outwardly devoted to his family, commit such an unfathomable act? The answer began to emerge through a closer look at Neil's personal life. Far from the image he had projected, Neil was struggling on nearly every front. He had exaggerated his career success, creating a false picture of himself as a thriving businessman when, in reality, he was unemployed and deep in financial trouble. Credit card debt mounted, bills went unpaid, and he had no realistic plan for turning things around. To make matters worse, his marriage was under strain. Rachel had expectations for stability and security, and Neil was failing to meet them. More disturbing still were Neil's online activities in the days leading up to the murders. Police uncovered internet searches that painted a dark portrait of his state of mind. He had been browsing escort services, suggesting a desire to escape the confines of his marriage. At the same time, he researched methods of suicide and even how to kill with a knife. This combination of fantasies, sexual indulgence, self-destruction, and violence, revealed a man deeply conflicted, someone teetering between desperation and dangerous impulse. For prosecutors, these searches became a critical piece of evidence in establishing motive. Neil saw his wife and child not as loved ones, but as obstacles to the life he secretly desired. Meanwhile, in England, Neil maintained a facade of innocence. To his family and the press, he insisted that he had nothing to do with the murders. His version of events suggested that he had discovered Rachel and Lillian already dead, implying that Rachel might have killed the baby before turning the gun on herself. It was a story that, on the surface, offered a tragic but plausible explanation. Yet the evidence did not support it. Forensic testing revealed no gunshot residue on Rachel's hands, eliminating the possibility that she had fired the weapon. The angle and trajectory of the bullets further confirmed that the shots could not have been self-inflicted. The theory of a murder-suicide collapsed under the weight of hard science, leaving Neil's defense without a credible alternative. Despite his protests, Neil could not outrun the investigation. In March 2006, after weeks of coordination between American and British authorities, he was extradited back to the United States. His return was covered heavily by the media, both in the US and the UK, as the story had by now become an international spectacle. A British man accused of murdering his American wife and child, then fleeing across the ocean, was the kind of narrative that gripped headlines and fueled public fascination. The tragedy resonated for reasons beyond the brutality of the crime. There was something uniquely unsettling about the contrast between the Entwistles' public image and the reality that emerged after the murders. To friends, they had seemed like a young couple on the threshold of a promising life together. They had a new baby, a new home, and the fresh energy of a family just starting out. But beneath that exterior were cracks that no one outside the marriage fully understood. Neil's secret struggles, his financial failures, his deception, his hidden desires, were all carefully concealed until the murders ripped away the illusion. As investigators built their case, the portrait of Neil became clearer. He was not simply a man who had snapped in a moment of rage. He was someone who had carefully cultivated lies about who he was and what he could offer. He had promised Rachel a life of comfort and stability, but what he delivered was disappointment and hardship. For a man obsessed with appearances, the pressure of maintaining the facade may have become unbearable. In that context, the murders began to look less like an impulsive act and more like a calculated decision to erase what he perceived as barriers to his freedom. Back in Massachusetts, the Entwistle home stood as a silent reminder of what had been lost. Friends and neighbors were left to reconcile the horrifying reality with the family they thought they knew. For Rachel's parents, the grief was immeasurable. Not only had they lost their daughter and granddaughter, but the man they had welcomed into their family was accused of being the one responsible. The betrayal cut as deeply as the loss itself. The first part of Neil Entwistle's story is one of appearances versus reality. It is a story of a young couple who seemed to embody hope and promise, but whose lives were fractured by secrets and lies. It is the story of a man who, rather than confronting his failures, chose the unthinkable, to destroy the very people who loved and trusted him most. As the case moved toward trial, the world waited to see whether justice would match the enormity of the crime. As the investigation progressed, Neil Entwistle's life began to unravel in ways that shocked even those who thought they knew him best. His return to Britain after the killings had already painted him as a man on the run, but it was the details uncovered in the months that followed which revealed how deeply his deceptions ran. To the outside world, Neil had projected an image of a highly skilled computer programmer and entrepreneur, a man who had lucrative projects and business ventures lined up. Yet investigators found that most of these claims were exaggerated or outright lies. In reality, Neil had been unemployed, living off Rachel's income, and facing mounting debts that he could not manage. His financial situation was precarious, but instead of seeking help, he chose to weave a story of success that could only hold for so long. Rachel, who had left behind the support system of her family to build a life with Neil, had trusted her husband's assurances. For a while, she may have believed his promises about their future. But those close to her noticed subtle shifts in her demeanor as the pressures grew. She remained devoted to her daughter, but there were signs that she was increasingly carrying the burden of responsibility. She leaned on her family for support, often calling her parents, though she never let on just how difficult things had become inside her home. The picture of stability Neil tried to maintain was fragile, and behind closed doors, the tension was mounting. What made Neil's behavior even more troubling was the discovery of his internet activity. Investigators found that in the days leading up to the murders, Neil had searched for escort services online, spending hours on websites that promised companionship and intimacy for a price. At the same time, he had visited sites that described methods of suicide and even pages about killing techniques. This dual obsession, seeking out sexual escapism while contemplating violence and death, offered a chilling glimpse into his mind. To prosecutors, it suggested that Neil was not only dissatisfied with his life, but actively considering ways to escape it, whether through fantasy, destruction, or both. The timeline of Neil's actions after the killings only deepened suspicion. He did not immediately notify anyone of the tragedy. He did not reach out for help, contact family, or even appear distressed in public. Instead, he removed himself from the scene, abandoned the life he had built in Massachusetts, and sought refuge with his parents in England. This decision was interpreted as a deliberate attempt to distance himself from the crime, a move that investigators argued betrayed his guilt. To those following the case, it raised a haunting question. What kind of husband and father, upon discovering such a horrific scene, would simply leave? Neil's claim that he had returned home to find Rachel and Lillian already dead was presented to his family and later repeated during his trial. But it was a story riddled with inconsistencies. The forensic evidence alone demolished his version of events. No residue was found on Rachel's hands. No evidence suggested she had handled the weapon, and the placement of the shots made it impossible for her to have killed herself. The baby's injury, inflicted at close range, spoke of a deliberate act, one that required someone else's hand. The clinical precision of the investigation stripped away the veil of Neil's explanation, leaving a stark and undeniable conclusion. By March 2006, the U.S. had secured Neil's extradition. When he was escorted off the plane and into custody, cameras captured his arrival, and the images were broadcast on both sides of the Atlantic. The case was by then a subject of public fascination, not only because of the brutality of the murders, but because of the cultural dynamics at play. A British man accused of killing his American wife and child. It was a story of betrayal and violence that resonated far beyond Massachusetts, sparking debates about family, trust, and the dark undercurrents that can exist in seemingly ordinary lives. The legal process moved steadily toward trial, and in preparation, the prosecution built a case rooted in both hard evidence and psychological portraiture. They would argue that Neil was a man consumed by lies, unable to face his failures, and desperate to reclaim a sense of control. Rachel and Lillian, in this interpretation, were not simply victims of circumstance, but the final barriers to Neil's imagined freedom. By removing them, he could start anew, at least in his own mind. This chilling theory underscored the cold calculation with which the prosecution believed the murders had been committed. On the other side, the defense faced a monumental challenge. With forensic evidence stacked against their client, they sought to cast doubt on the state's narrative by emphasizing Neil's emotional state. They argued that he was a man overwhelmed, not murderous, and suggested again that Rachel may have played a role in the tragedy. They portrayed Neil as someone who had discovered a scene so unbearable that his only response was to flee. It was a defense that hinged not on disproving the evidence, but on creating enough uncertainty to prevent a unanimous verdict. As the trial approached in 2008, the case had already become a fixture in the media. Newspapers in both Britain and the U.S. followed every development, dissecting Neil's background, Rachel's life, and the family's history. Television networks framed the story as a tale of domestic tragedy and deception, captivating audiences with its mix of love, betrayal, and murder. For Rachel's family, however, the publicity was an added wound. They were forced to grieve in the public eye, their pain dissected for headlines, even as they waited for justice to be served. The weight of the case lay not only in the brutal facts of the murders, but in the deeper themes it exposed. It was a reminder that the image a person presents to the world can be drastically different from the reality of their private life. It revealed how fragile trust can be, and how quickly a dream of family and stability can unravel when built on deception. Neil's story was not just about financial failure or marital strain. It was about the lengths to which a person will go to escape accountability. By the time the trial began, the stakes were clear. For the prosecution, it was a chance to hold Neil accountable for an act that had devastated 2 families and shocked 2 nations. For the defense, it was an uphill battle to preserve even a shred of doubt in the minds of jurors. And for Rachel's family, it was the moment they had waited for, an opportunity to see the man they believed had betrayed and destroyed their daughter finally face the consequences. The courtroom would soon become the stage where these competing narratives collided. The jury would be asked to sift through lies and evidence, emotion and logic, to reach a verdict that matched the enormity of the crime. But long before the verdict, the story of Neil Entwistle had already left its mark, a cautionary tale about secrets, desperation, and the devastating cost of one man's choices. When the trial of Neil Entwistle finally began in June 2008, more than 2 years after the murders, the anticipation was immense. The courthouse in Middlesex County, Massachusetts, became the focal point of an international audience. Journalists packed the seats, television cameras lingered outside, and every day brought new headlines. The case had all the elements of a tragic drama: a young mother and child brutally murdered, a father accused of killing them, and a narrative that spanned both America and Britain. What unfolded in the courtroom was a meticulous dissection of evidence, character, and motive, told in front of 12 jurors who carried the weight of delivering justice. The prosecution opened with a stark and chilling presentation. They laid out the timeline of January 20th, 2006, painting Neil as the central actor in a calculated act of violence. Jurors were shown photographs of the crime scene, the bloodstained bed where Rachel and Lillian's bodies were found, and forensic diagrams illustrating the trajectory of the bullets. It was an emotional introduction, and the jury could not avoid the human tragedy at the heart of the case. But beyond emotion, the prosecutors anchored their arguments in hard facts. They pointed to the weapon traced back to Rachel's father's gun collection, the absence of any forced entry, the deliberate act of returning the firearm to its case, and Neil's immediate flight to England. Each detail, they argued, showed not a panicked man, but a deliberate killer. To strengthen their narrative, prosecutors leaned heavily on Neil's internet searches. Jurors were told of his visits to escort sites, his fascination with suicide methods, and his disturbing interest in how to kill with a knife. These searches, conducted just days before the murders, painted a portrait of a man dissatisfied with his reality and seeking escape in fantasies of sex and violence. The prosecution argued that Neil was driven not by sudden rage, but by mounting frustration and self-centered desire. He had constructed a web of lies about his career and finances, and when those lies began to collapse, he chose to eliminate his family rather than face exposure. The defense countered with a softer, more emotional appeal. They asked jurors to consider Neil not as a murderer, but as a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. They returned to the argument that Rachel could have been responsible for the deaths, suggesting she may have killed her daughter in a moment of despair before turning the gun on herself. They emphasized Neil's shock at discovering the bodies and his inability to cope, which explained his flight to England. The defense leaned heavily on character witnesses who spoke of Neil as intelligent, polite, and unlikely to commit such brutality. But their case rested on creating doubt rather than offering a coherent alternative supported by evidence. The most powerful moments of the trial came not from lawyers, but from the witnesses. Rachel's family sat through the proceedings, forced to relive the horror of losing their daughter and granddaughter. When Rachel's father testified about the missing gun, the courtroom grew silent. His voice cracked as he described how the weapon had been taken from his home and used against his own family. For the jury, the testimony humanized the case beyond forensics. It was not only about a crime scene, it was about real people whose lives had been devastated. Forensic experts dismantled the defense's murder-suicide theory with precision. They testified that the angles of the gunshot wounds made it physically impossible for Rachel to have killed herself. They explained the absence of residue on her hands and demonstrated how the evidence pointed unequivocally to a shooter standing over the bed. The experts' calm and scientific testimony left little room for ambiguity. The murder-suicide defense, once presented as a potential explanation, dissolved under the weight of these findings. As the trial stretched on, the jurors were confronted not only with gruesome evidence, but also with glimpses into Neil's character. They saw emails he had sent, financial records revealing his debts, and the stark contrast between the life he claimed to have and the reality he lived. Prosecutors painted him as a man who had mastered the art of deception, someone who preferred illusion over truth, and who, when cornered, made the ultimate and irreversible choice. Closing arguments crystallized the divide between the two sides. The prosecution delivered a powerful summation, reminding jurors of Neil's lies, his internet searches, the forensic certainty, and his suspicious flight to England. They framed the murders as selfish acts committed by a man who valued his image and desires above his family's lives. The defense, in contrast, urged jurors to resist the pull of outrage and look at the possibility of doubt. They suggested Neil's actions after the crime, his silence, his disappearance, were those of a man paralyzed by grief, not guilt. They asked the jury to consider whether the state had truly proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Neil was the killer. The jury deliberated for only a few days, but inside the courthouse, those days felt like an eternity. The world waited for the verdict, and the Entwistle family in Britain remained steadfast in their support of Neil, insisting he was innocent. Rachel's family, on the other hand, prayed for justice, hoping that the trial would finally bring accountability. When the jury returned, the tension was palpable. On June 25, 2008, the verdict was read: guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, as well as illegal possession of a firearm and ammunition. The courtroom erupted in quiet sobs from Rachel's family, while Neil sat expressionless, his face betraying none of the turmoil around him. The sentence was swift and unyielding: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Rachel's family, it was a measure of justice, though it could never replace what had been lost. For Neil's supporters in Britain, it was a crushing conclusion, one they continued to question despite the overwhelming evidence. In the aftermath, the case left an indelible mark on both sides of the Atlantic. In Massachusetts, it became one of the most haunting examples of domestic murder in state history, a chilling reminder that violence can erupt even in the most seemingly ordinary households. In Britain, the case sparked debates about cultural perceptions of justice, with some questioning whether Neil had been fairly tried in the glare of American media attention. Yet for most observers, the evidence was clear, and the conviction was just. Neil began his sentence in a maximum security prison, his life reduced to routine and confinement. The man who had once presented himself as ambitious and successful was now stripped of illusions, remembered only for betrayal and brutality. Rachel and Lillian's lives were honored through vigils, memorials. In the quiet streets of Swansea, an ordinary life hid decades of tension. Behind closed doors, a long-married couple's frustration simmered, unnoticed by neighbors. One day, in 2023, years of unresolved conflict would ignite into a single, tragic moment, forever altering lives and shocking a peaceful community. In the quiet streets of Swansea, Wales, a story unfolded in 2023 that would shock the local community and capture the attention of those following true crime from across the country. This is the story of David Clark and his wife, Helen Clark, a couple whose long marriage concealed tensions that would eventually culminate in a tragic and irreversible event. David Clark, at the age of 80, was a trained electrical engineer, a man whose life had been defined by logic, precision, and years of technical expertise. He had built a career on problem-solving and careful planning, and yet, within the confines of his own home, the life he led with Helen told a very different story. Helen Clark, like her husband, was a senior citizen. Those who knew her described a gentle, quiet presence, a woman who had lived a lifetime alongside David, but who, over the years, had experienced the strain of persistent marital discord. Their marriage, spanning several decades, was characterized by long-standing tensions. Neighbors occasionally heard loud arguments echoing from their home, revealing the frustration and dissatisfaction that had quietly built up over many years. While the couple had maintained appearances for the sake of family and routine, the reality within their household was far more complicated. In the months and years leading up to the incident, it became evident that the strain between David and Helen had reached an unsustainable level. Arguments over small matters often escalated, sometimes lingering for days, leaving emotional scars that accumulated silently. Friends and neighbors noted that the couple's interactions had changed over time. The warmth that had once marked their relationship had given way to a rigid pattern of tension, distance, and occasional hostility. These signs, though subtle to outsiders, hinted at the fragile state of the marriage, a fragility that would eventually set the stage for the tragic events that followed. On that day, in 2023, the air in Swansea was like any other. Streets were calm, routine carried on, and the community moved through its ordinary rhythm. Yet inside the Clark household, a culmination of years of unresolved conflict quietly reached a critical point. David Clark, a man who had spent decades carefully managing his professional and personal life, faced an emotional tipping point. The precise details of what triggered the final escalation are known only through witness accounts and police reports, but it is clear that the moment was the result of long-standing dissatisfaction and emotional strain. The events that would soon follow were the outcome of a lifetime of tension. In their vehicle, a symbol of daily life and routine, a confrontation occurred that escalated far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. The car, an ordinary part of the couple's life, became the setting for a tragic confrontation. Within this confined space, a critical turning point in the story unfolded, marking the beginning of actions that would have irreversible consequences. The ordinary day transformed into one of the darkest chapters in Swansea's recent history, a chapter defined by both its suddenness and the weight of years that led up to it. Neighbors recalled seeing the couple enter their car that day, a routine seemingly no different from any other. But this ordinary moment concealed the intensity of emotions that had been building over decades. Within the vehicle, the private frustrations, grievances, and resentments between David and Helen reached their apex. While the precise nature of the conversation or argument at that moment remains private, it became the setting for the beginning of a tragic sequence. The car, usually a place of travel and daily life, became an isolated space where the tensions between husband and wife could no longer be contained. David Clark, an individual accustomed to control and precision, was at that moment overwhelmed by emotion. The psychological landscape within the car had shifted from argument to confrontation, the kind that occurs when long-suppressed anger and frustration meet in a confined space. For years, the couple had experienced disputes that ebbed and flowed, leaving behind emotional residue that neither party could fully resolve. In the isolated space of their car, the culmination of those years of tension manifested in a way that would define the tragic day in Swansea. The significance of the day lies not only in the actions that occurred, but also in the context in which they took place. This was not a sudden, impulsive decision without precedent. The circumstances of David and Helen's life together, the accumulation of grievances, and the inability to resolve conflict contributed to a situation in which tragedy became possible. It was the intersection of personal history, emotion, and circumstance that set the stage for what would soon unfold, making the events of that day a grim reminder of how long-term interpersonal tension can escalate when left unaddressed. As the day progressed, the local community remained unaware of the critical events occurring within the Clark household. To the outside world, the couple continued their routine, leaving no immediate indication of the depth of the emotional conflict or the looming consequences. This hidden dimension underscores a pattern often seen in domestic conflicts: the external appearance of normalcy masking the internal accumulation of stress and unresolved issues. The outward calm of Swansea streets contrasted sharply with the turmoil building in the lives of David and Helen Clark. The narrative of this day serves as an important prelude to the events that would later come to light through police investigation, witness accounts, and legal proceedings. Understanding the background, the ages, occupations, and long-standing marital tensions provides critical insight into how the tragedy occurred. While the full impact of the actions taken by David Clark would become evident later, the early part of the story highlights the ordinary, human dimensions of the couple's life and the emotional pressures that ultimately reached a breaking point. A senior couple, long married, living in a community where neighbors occasionally witnessed tensions, but no one anticipated the tragedy to come. It underscores the significance of long-term relational stress, how routine life can conceal deep personal struggles, and how ordinary settings, like a family car, can become the stage for events that change lives forever. In Swansea, the quiet streets would later bear witness to a story that began as many domestic lives do, with ordinary routines, years of unspoken tension, and the subtle buildup of unresolved conflict. By examining these early moments, we gain insight into the circumstances that shaped the unfolding tragedy, laying the foundation for understanding the full story of David and Helen Clark. As the day in Swansea progressed, the tension between David and Helen Clark, long simmering beneath the surface, reached a decisive point. By this stage, the ordinary routines of daily life had been replaced by an atmosphere of escalating conflict. Within the confines of their home and vehicle, years of accumulated frustration, disappointment, and unresolved disputes had created a volatile emotional landscape. It is in such moments where stress and personal history intersect that ordinary situations can quickly become critical, and the events that were about to unfold were shaped by decades of marital tension. On that day, in 2023, the couple's interaction had reached an intensity that made it impossible for either to step back without consequences. While the exact words exchanged are not publicly known, witness accounts and later investigations highlighted that the situation within the Clark household was far from routine. The atmosphere was charged, reflecting not only the immediate disagreement, but also the unresolved patterns of conflict that had defined their relationship over many years. In situations like these, psychological research suggests the cumulative effect of long-standing emotional stress can create an environment where rational decision-making is impaired and reactive behavior becomes more likely. The critical events began inside the vehicle. For David Clark, the car had become more than a place of transportation. It was now the setting in which a lifetime of marital conflict reached a breaking point. Within this confined space, the interaction between the couple escalated, and what had begun as another argument transformed into a decisive and tragic moment. The significance of the location is notable. An everyday object, a car, became a private stage for the unfolding of a crisis that would have irreversible consequences. Neighbors later described seeing the car in the driveway and noticing unusual movements, though at the time, none realized the gravity of the situation. In hindsight, these subtle cues revealed the sudden shift from ordinary domestic tension to an urgent and dangerous confrontation. While onlookers were unaware, the events taking place were the result of years of unresolved emotional strain and frustration, now concentrated into a single moment of extreme intensity. Such situations often develop quietly, leaving little warning for those outside the immediate environment, highlighting the private nature of domestic conflict and its potential for sudden escalation. In the hours leading up to the incident, David Clark's behavior indicated a focus and determination unusual for the couple's normal disagreements. Individuals accustomed to control, as David was in both his personal and professional life, often exhibit a heightened focus during moments of conflict. In this case, that focus translated into decisive action within the vehicle, a critical turning point that would soon become central to the investigation. While the full psychological motivations remain complex, it is clear that the events were not random, but rather the culmination of long-term interpersonal dynamics. The tragic turning point in Swansea did not happen in isolation. Years of unresolved tension had built a foundation in which emotion overwhelmed reason. Helen Clark, a woman described by those who knew her as gentle and patient, had been living with the consequences of prolonged marital strain. The pattern of conflict between the two, characterized by repeated arguments and emotional friction, created a dynamic that, on that day, escalated to a level neither had experienced before. Within the confined space of the car, the ordinary interaction between husband and wife became an extraordinary and tragic moment in time. While the immediate events themselves were fast-moving, the context surrounding them was deeply significant. A combination of decades-long marital difficulties, emotional exhaustion, and personal history converged on a single day. To outside observers, the couple's life appeared routine. They were respected members of their community, living quietly in Swansea. Yet, within the privacy of their home and vehicle, the culmination of long-term conflict created a situation that would have devastating consequences. The contrast between public perception and private reality is a recurring theme in cases of domestic tragedy, highlighting how prolonged tension, when unaddressed, can reach critical points with unforeseen results. As the confrontation unfolded, the environment of isolation and privacy meant there were no immediate interventions or external witnesses capable of altering the outcome. This lack of interruption is often a factor in domestic tragedies, allowing events to escalate in ways that may not occur in public spaces. The combination of confinement, emotional intensity, and unresolved relational patterns contributed to a sequence of events that would ultimately result in catastrophic consequences for Helen Clark. The significance of this stage in the story lies in its role as the bridge between long-standing marital difficulties and the final, irreversible actions that would follow. By focusing on the build-up and immediate circumstances, it becomes clear that the tragedy was not a sudden accident, but the result of a complex interplay of factors, including age, long-term tension, personality traits, and the context of their shared life. Each of these elements added to the pressure of the moment, making the eventual outcome tragically inevitable once the confrontation reached its peak. During this period, emergency responders were not yet involved, and the community remained unaware of the seriousness of the situation. The ordinary streets of Swansea continued their routines, contrasting sharply with the crisis developing inside the Clark household. The hidden nature of the unfolding events emphasizes the importance of context in understanding domestic tragedies. Appearances can be deceiving, and serious conflicts often occur away from the public eye, unnoticed, until irreversible consequences arise. The moments leading up to the climactic actions were characterized by tension, decision-making under stress, and the culmination of years of relational strain. David Clark, whose life had been shaped by structure and precision, was confronted with intense emotions and long-suppressed frustrations. In the confines of the vehicle, these pressures manifested in ways that neither David nor Helen could control. It was a turning point where the accumulation of past grievances, emotional fatigue, and the intensity of immediate conflict converged to create a situation that would soon cross the threshold into tragedy. By examining this stage of the story, the critical factors contributing to the eventual outcome become evident. The combination of decades of unresolved tension, emotional intensity, and environmental isolation illustrates how ordinary circumstances can transform into extraordinary crises. It also underscores a key element in understanding domestic incidents. The path to tragedy is often shaped over many years, with seemingly minor events and persistent patterns of conflict contributing to a critical tipping point. This second part of the story, while not yet revealing the final legal outcome, provides insight into the human and environmental factors that made the tragedy possible. It emphasizes that what may appear as an ordinary day in a quiet community can, in fact, conceal complex dynamics and unresolved issues. By tracing the escalation of tension and the psychological and relational factors at play, it becomes clear how a lifetime of accumulated conflict and frustration can lead to a moment of irreversible consequence. As the narrative approaches the final stage, the focus shifts from the build-up to the actions themselves, the immediate consequences, and the legal aftermath. Understanding the context, the individuals involved, and the escalation process provides essential clarity, setting the stage for the final chapter of the Swansea car fire story. In this way, Part 2 bridges the ordinary life and long-term tensions of the Clark household with the climactic events that will define the tragic outcome. The events that had been building over decades reached their tragic conclusion in Swansea. The private confrontation between David and Helen Clark, which had been escalating in their vehicle, culminated in a moment that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. The culmination of long-standing marital tension, frustration, and emotional strain had created a scenario in which ordinary resolution was no longer possible. Within the confined space of the car, the situation intensified, leaving no opportunity for intervention or reconciliation. On that day, in 2023, the domestic dispute took on an irreversible form. The critical decisions made in those moments were the direct result of years of accumulated grievances and emotional exhaustion. While the precise details of what David Clark felt or thought are known only to him, the outcome was clear and devastating. The vehicle, a routine part of daily life, became the scene of an irreversible tragedy. The ordinary turned extraordinary, and the quiet streets of Swansea would soon be witness to the aftermath of a deeply personal and long-simmering conflict. Helen Clark, described by friends and family as a patient and gentle woman, was at the center of this tragic moment. Her life, shaped by decades alongside David, reflected the ordinary rhythms of a long marriage, disrupted by persistent tension and conflict. For years, she had endured arguments, moments of hostility, and the stress of a relationship in which harmony was often elusive. The culmination of these experiences played a significant role in the events that unfolded. It is a reminder that domestic conflict, when left unresolved over time, can intensify in ways that ordinary observers may never anticipate. As the situation escalated, the broader community remained unaware of the immediate danger. Neighbors later recounted their surprise at the sudden attention drawn to the Clark household. The outward appearance of routine life had masked a crisis developing behind closed doors. This contrast between public perception and private reality is a central theme in many domestic cases. The world may see order and calm, while within, complex emotions and long-standing issues reach critical intensity. In Swansea, this invisible tension had finally surfaced in a way that could not be undone. Once the confrontation reached its peak, the consequences became apparent. Emergency services were contacted, responding to the situation that had rapidly escalated beyond control. By the time first responders arrived, it was clear that the outcome was catastrophic. The incident was investigated thoroughly, with police and fire services examining the scene to understand the sequence of events. Investigators concluded that the tragedy was the result of deliberate actions informed by years of relational conflict, rather than a sudden accident or misjudgment. In the following days, the legal process began to unfold. David Clark was taken into custody, and police collected evidence to document the circumstances of the incident. The investigation revealed a history of tension within the Clark household, consistent with witness accounts and neighbor observations. This evidence highlighted the long-term nature of the conflict between David and Helen and provided context for the decisions that led to the fatal outcome. While no one could undo the events of that day, the thorough documentation of the circumstances would later play a crucial role in the judicial process. Throughout the investigation, authorities maintained a careful, methodical approach. Interviews with neighbors, friends, and family members painted a picture of a marriage marked by long-term difficulty and emotional strain. Investigators emphasized the importance of understanding the broader context, acknowledging that while the actions themselves were the immediate cause of tragedy, they were influenced by decades of unresolved issues. This perspective allowed the legal system to consider both the human and procedural dimensions of the case. The court proceedings that followed were conducted with a focus on clarity, fairness, and the careful presentation of evidence. In a courtroom setting, The full sequence of events, along with a history of marital tension, was presented to ensure that the legal response addressed the circumstances comprehensively. David Clarke faced the weight of legal accountability for his actions, while the evidence highlighted both the immediate and long-term factors that had contributed to the incident. The process emphasized the importance of meticulous documentation and the careful evaluation of human behavior in legal decision-making. It was during these proceedings that David Clarke entered his plea. He pleaded guilty to the charges related to the death of his wife, acknowledging responsibility for his actions. This admission brought clarity to the legal process, allowing the court to proceed to sentencing while considering the circumstances surrounding the incident. The guilty plea also provided a formal recognition of accountability, a necessary step in the judicial resolution of a case of this magnitude.